The test plan changed a little bit. We're just going to cover the main differences and successes that came from the original presentation about the test plan. The biggest change in the way the libraries we're using for testing is that we used Entity Framework for our integrations test as we changed from the .NET MVC to .NET Core. The Entity Framework just allowed easy faking of the database for controller tests. Our test plan, the big change here is in that bottom right corner, there used to be a whole acceptance branch that the engineers would check into. We discovered we just did not have the time or resources to make a whole nother branch, figure out deployment builds, and so on, to have some acceptance branch where the product manager could evaluate whether the feature should be checked into the master branch. So the engineers just took a feature branch, did what they needed to on there, and then merged it onto master where it could be reviewed in production. Everything else, though, the general framework for testing remained the same, except for, again, that change to entity on the integrations test. Our acceptance test met its goal. So we had a goal of an acceptance test for every feature, and that stayed. And you can run those by with ng E2E. That's the Angular's end-to-end testing is what we use for our acceptance. Still used Protractor, by the way. Our integrations test, we met our goal, which was a test for every CRUD operation that we had. And we also made some services that helped the controller test, mostly around ranking or maybe interpreting calls from the front end and deserializing them into the back end. So those service tests were tested as well. Those services were tested as well, and all that is done through .NET test command. In our unit test, we managed to test all of our behaviors, and perhaps one of the biggest refactorings we did was splitting our Angular into containers and presenters, and we tested all the logic on the containers. And for the presenters, there shouldn't be any logic in there. So it helped us as a code smell to know if we were writing many tests for a presentational component, we were probably needed to hoist those things into a container. And you can run all those with ng test. Our test metrics were successfully achieved the way we thought they would be, which is all during test. And the downtime, though, was greater than 5%. So we wanted it less than 5%, but it was greater. And I think that's just generally because the architecture we made was hard to implement, and there was a lot of back and forth with the IT department on how to set everything up at first, and eventually the builds would break as we would try to change it and remodel our whole app and things like that. So it was probably down 30 to 42%. And luckily, we were still developing that architecture, so we think that was an acceptable amount since it wasn't live to any users. And our retrieval rate for hitting our page is still less than 3 seconds, which is great. Our system testing, user testing did change a lot. Frankly, we realized just pairing was almost never going to happen. It's so hard for the 6 of us as distance learners to sync all of our clocks together, So we just did our best to let the tests speak for themselves. And for that went well, but we really did not care about execution. Since we were just rushing to MVP, there was never enough time in feature development to go back and worry, is this executing the most efficient way possible? And it was also never enough of a burden that we were worried about it as an engineer team. We did some good refactoring, some I'll mention up briefly earlier, which was our Angular stuff changing to the containers in presentational section. That was a great refactoring that we did, as well as removing the booksrus.model that we had when we were in .NET MVC. It was kind of a leftover from our change into .NET Core. So we removed all that stuff and just ended up making one single repository instead of 2 repos. And then in terms of how we were implementing, you can see through the stories charts and the burndown charts, it just got better as we went along. So we were less concerned because the features were still the baseline for what we were doing. We just did our best to make that all work. One of the positive things were from the project manager's aspect, where there were no bugs. Everything worked as intended. And all the corrections we needed to make were mostly design related, like the look of things. And we would just fix those as the test went on instead of rejecting them because we didn't really have time. Nobody was consistently engineering every day like a company. So it's not like we could just reject a story and somebody would get to it right away to go fix a thing. So we would just fix those minor details in line with the next feature that we developed. And the designer, for the usability stuff, the website was down sometimes, but we would just run it locally and make sure that it all worked, and that was good. Same with the usefulness. Whenever the designer would find anything that wasn't quite as useful as we thought, we just throw it into the next story instead of like rejecting that story and doing it all over again. And one thing that we noted for improvements was a book description would help. Once we had the API from Google Books, there are so many books that we'd never even heard of. And we're like, man, I wonder what that book's about. I bet a user would want to know what that book's about too. So one day in the future, we'd love to see some book descriptions get included as an improvement to our app.